And then if we are looking at the triple combo of world economic problem, high inflation and then low growth rate and then high interest rates, do you think what the policy maybe of mixed policy, I think, from monetary and then fiscal and financial sector to shield the countries and then out from this problem?
Yeah, I think the priority is to bring inflation down, and inflation is too high at the moment. There's a combination of shocks that have brought inflation up. And what we should do, and this is something that we explained in some detail in the BIS annual economic report, is to adjust policy rates in a timely and decisive way to bring down inflation. And the topic of my presentation this morning was on the path to a soft landing. And the path to a soft landing is narrow, but I think it is still feasible. And it has to do with bringing down demand to meet the diminished capacity, the supply capacity. And two of the features that actually make the soft landing more likely are the very strong demand that we see, the very high vacancy rates in the labor market in some of the advanced economies, but in particular, a front-loaded rate hiking cycle we find is more conducive to a softer landing, in that it prevents having to raise interest rates higher over a much more prolonged period. So that's on the monetary policy side. On the financial stability side, there are possible measures that one can take when financial conditions really tighten too much, that actually mitigate some of the financial tightening, and those are more remedial measures that can mitigate. But they're not long-term fundamental issues, long-term fundamental policy solutions. So in the first instance, it's monetary policy to get inflation down, while on the other hand, making sure that financial stability in the short term can be also mitigated through other liquidity policies.
But do you think the high inflation, the condition now, what is the fundamental problem?
Yeah, so we went through a very severe pandemic. And I think what we are now realizing is that the supply side of the economy is incredibly important for us to understand the future course of the economy. So initially we saw supply chain bottlenecks. We saw the immediate effect of lockdown in some economies. But I think that there are lingering effects of those initial pandemic measures. And I talked about the labor market in my presentation. But also with the war in Ukraine, we've had this sequence of supply-side shocks, in particular the rise in food and the rise in commodity prices. Now, those shocks will dissipate. So that is actually one of the reasons why you may believe that a soft landing is more conducive, and that those supply-side shocks will eventually dissipate. And provided that monetary policy can be steered in the correct way, and we had more front-loading of the interest rate hikes, then I think that is the scenario that is most conducive to a soft landing.
Okay, seeing the pressure causes by uncertainty, we know this condition is very uncertainty. High inflation has made several countries depressed and even bankrupt, like Sri Lanka. And then what do you think the condition of developing countries will be if this pressure condition?
So let me speak more generally rather than speaking about individual countries. But clearly, developing and emerging markets are going to be impacted most when there is a global shock, and if there's a global tightening of financial conditions, because these are typically the economies that have the thinnest financial markets and have less of a history of the institutional, if you like, the institutional safeguards. But even in those cases, provided that monetary and fiscal policy as a basic pillar of macro management are in place and are being conducted well, then you can complement those policies with other macro financial stability tools that can complement. Now, for the G20, the BIS submitted a report on the macro financial stability policy frameworks and this is the report that the BIS submitted to the G20 this year. And what we lay out is a holistic view of how one can put monetary and fiscal policy right at the center of the macro stabilization framework, but then complement that with, for example, macroprudential frameworks, FX intervention, and capital flow management policies, as well as other structural policies. And what we argue is that currently, monetary policy is fully occupied by its task to tackle inflation. And therefore, it really has to fall on the other complementary policies in order to smooth the transition to calmer waters, if you like.
The high inflation in USA make a global condition is not good, I think. And then we see the shadow of recession in a big country. Seems like United States are visible, I think. Do you think what the country must make mitigation?
Yeah. So let me again, speak more generally rather than speaking about a particular country. I think it's certainly true that financial markets have really sort of borne the brunt of the initial stages of this inflationary spike. And it's certainly true that viewers who are working in financial markets, will feel this much more. I think for the real economy, if we look at the real side, of course, inflation is very high and needs to be brought down. But if you look at employment, if you look at growth, that is still pretty robust. And one of the things that I emphasized in my presentation this morning is that if you have strong growth and you have high vacancy rates in the labor market, those are the conditions where a front-loaded monetary tightening can actually be still consistent with a soft landing, in that you can reduce inflation in a way that doesn't impact directly the level of employment. And you can actually, we based the study that I mentioned on 70 rate hiking cycles from 1980. And the evidence points to that, if the preconditions are such that, it's more conducive to a soft landing, then that can be pulled off. On the other hand, set against the strong growth and the high vacancy rates, we have, for example, a very flat yield curve, which is not conducive to a soft landing. Typically, that is associated with a hard landing. And we've also had a very rapid increase in inflation, again, which is not very conducive to a soft landing. So I think it's fair to say that the scorecard is mixed, but the path to a soft landing, I think, is still there, but it's a very narrow path, and it's a very narrowing path. And it's incumbent on central banks and other policymakers to actually act in a very quick and decisive way.